Every 50 years, ancient Israel hit the ultimate economic reset button. Slaves walked free, debts vanished, and land returned to its original owners, no matter how much money changed hands. Today, we're diving deep into Leviticus 25, one of history's most radical economic experiments. You'll discover how the Sabbath year and Jubilee challenged everything we think we know about ownership, why caring for the poor was built into the legal system, and how these ancient principles connect to modern debates about wealth inequality. Let me bring in someone who spent years studying these fascinating connections.
You know what strikes me most about Leviticus 25? It's not just ancient history, it's a complete reimagining of how society should work. The chapter outlines two interconnected systems, the Sabbath year every 7th year and the Jubilee every 50th year. Both were designed to prevent what we'd call systemic poverty today.
Wait, so this wasn't just about religious observance? This was actual economic policy?
Absolutely. During the Sabbath year, according to Leviticus 25:4, there was to be a Sabbath of complete rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Oreh. No sowing fields, no pruning vineyards. But here's the kicker, all debts were also cancelled. Deuteronomy 15, Years 1-2 is explicit about this.
Every 7 years, all debts just disappeared?
Every single one. And then the Jubilee took it even further. Leviticus 25:10 declares, "And you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants." Land returned to original families, slaves were freed, and it was like hitting a societal reset button.
That's incredible. But how did this actually work in practice? I mean, if I knew my debt would be forgiven in a few years, wouldn't that create some serious moral hazard?
That's exactly the kind of question modern economists ask. But here's what's fascinating. The system was built on a completely different foundation. According to the page content, the land ultimately belonged to God, and the Israelites were merely stewards. Leviticus 25:23 states, "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me you are but aliens and tenants."
So it wasn't really about ownership at all?
Exactly. And this extends to people too. Leviticus 25:42 says, "For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt." The theological foundation was that both land and people belong to God, so both are released in the Jubilee from any other claim on them.
That's a pretty radical concept. But let me ask you about something specific I noticed in the research. There's this interesting distinction between walled cities and unwalled villages. What's that about?
Oh, this is where it gets really nuanced. According to Leviticus 25:2-9-31, houses in walled cities had different rules. If you sold a house in a walled city, you only had 1 year to buy it back. After that, it belonged permanently to the buyer and wasn't released in the Jubilee.
But unwalled villages were different?
Completely different. Houses in unwalled villages were to be treated as open country, they could be redeemed any time and were automatically released in the Jubilee. The page content explains that walled cities functioned as commercial hubs, while unwalled villages were essentially rural hamlets, inseparable from agricultural plots.
So location determined your economic rights?
In a sense, yes, but it was more about function. City dwellers could pursue trade or relocation, while rural families depended on ancestral soil for subsistence. Losing the house meant losing functional access to the land. The law protected that connection.
That's fascinating. And I'm curious about the archaeological evidence for this. Did these distinctions actually exist in ancient Israel?
The archaeological record is pretty compelling. Sites like Tel Es-Safi, Lachish and Hazor show massive fortification lines, clear walled cities. But sites like Hirbet el-Makatir reveal unwalled agrarian clusters with dwellings spaced around threshing floors and cisterns, ringed by fields rather than walls.
So the biblical categories match what archaeologists are finding?
Exactly. Even cuneiform tablets from places like Alalak use identical terminology, house of the city versus house of the field. The biblical categories fit seamlessly into this ancient Near Eastern context.
Now, all of this sounds incredibly idealistic. But what about the practical reality of caring for people who fell through the cracks? How did this system actually help the poor?
That's where the genius of the system really shows. It wasn't just about periodic resets, there were ongoing provisions. The page content mentions gleaning laws from Leviticus 19:9-10, where landowners couldn't harvest the edges of their fields, leaving them for the poor and foreigners.
So there was a built-in social safety net?
More than that, it was systematic economic justice. Deuteronomy 15:11 commands, "For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you to open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, and to the poor in your land. It acknowledged poverty as an ongoing reality while mandating active response.
And this wasn't just Old Testament stuff, right? I noticed connections to the New Testament and even Pentecost. How does that work?
The connections are really striking. Pentecost, which means the 50th, was observed 50 days after Passover. And here's what's fascinating. The Living Church of God notes that numbers are important to God, including the number 50, which connects Pentecost, the Jubilee, and even the Tabernacle.
Wait, so the 50-day count to Pentecost mirrors the 50-year Jubilee cycle?
Exactly. And when you look at what happened at Pentecost in Acts 2, the early church immediately began sharing possessions and caring for each other's needs. Acts 2:44-45 describes believers having all things in common and selling possessions to distribute to anyone in need.
So they were essentially living out Jubilee principles?
That's exactly what it looks like. The page content notes that this communal sharing reflected the transformative power of the gospel in fostering a community marked by generosity and mutual care. It was Jubilee economics in action.
And Jesus himself seemed to embrace these themes, right?
Absolutely. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus declared, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The page content emphasizes that this highlighted the spiritual value and dignity of the poor, affirming their place in God's kingdom.
But here's what I'm wrestling with. How do we apply these ancient principles today? I mean, we're not an agrarian society, we don't have slavery in the same way, and our economic systems are completely different.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But I think the principles translate more directly than we might expect. The page content suggests that in modern terms, this calls for fair economic practices, balanced wealth distribution, and opportunities for financial recovery for everyone.
So we're talking about things like debt forgiveness programs, progressive taxation, maybe even universal basic income?
Those could be modern expressions, yes. But here's what I find most challenging. The Jubilee wasn't just about economic policy. It was about fundamentally reimagining ownership itself. The principle that ultimate ownership belongs to God and we're merely stewards, that's revolutionary.
That does challenge pretty much everything about how we think about private property and wealth accumulation.
Exactly. And it wasn't just theoretical. The page content notes that the Jubilee served as a reset button for the economy, ensuring that no family would be permanently disenfranchised. It was designed to prevent the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few.
Which sounds remarkably relevant to current debates about wealth inequality.
It really does. But here's what's interesting. It wasn't just about redistribution. The system encouraged what the page content calls ethical business practices, fair lending, and the avoidance of exploitative economic systems. It was proactive, not just reactive.
And there was this spiritual dimension too, right? It wasn't just economics, it was about rest and reflection?
Absolutely. The page content describes the Jubilee as a time of rest and reflection, a sabbatical for the land and its people. It encouraged a lifestyle of generosity where material possessions are held loosely and the focus is on eternal values rather than temporal wealth.
That's such a different mindset from our culture of constant growth and accumulation.
It really is. And I think that's part of why these principles feel so challenging today. We've built entire economic systems around the assumption that more is always better, that growth must be infinite. The Sabbath year literally mandated stopping.
Speaking of stopping, I'm curious about the practical side. How did people actually survive during these Sabbath years when they couldn't farm?
Great question. According to Leviticus 25:20-22, God promised to provide enough produce in the 6th year to sustain people through the 7th year and into the 8th year until new crops were harvested. It was fundamentally about trusting in divine provision.
So it required a pretty significant leap of faith?
Absolutely. The page content notes that this practice was intended to demonstrate trust in God's provision. It was as much about spiritual formation as economic policy. You had to believe that God would take care of you if you followed these principles.
And what about the redemption aspect? I noticed there were provisions for buying back land and people between Jubilee years.
Yes, that's crucial. The page content explains that if land or people were sold to pay debts, the nearest relative was supposed to redeem them by buying them back. The purchase price was calculated according to the years until the next Jubilee.
So there was this whole kinship network of mutual support?
Exactly. It created what we might call a social safety net based on family and community relationships. No one was supposed to fall through the cracks permanently because there were multiple layers of protection built into the system.
Now, I have to ask, did this system actually work? Do we have any evidence that ancient Israel successfully implemented these principles?
That's honestly one of the big historical questions. We don't have extensive records of Jubilee years being observed consistently, but what we do have is the prophetic literature constantly calling Israel back to these principles of justice and mercy, which suggests they were the ideal, even if the practice was inconsistent.
So maybe the value isn't in perfect implementation, but in having these principles as a North Star?
I think that's exactly right. The page content notes that Isaiah 58:6-7 calls for loosening the chains of injustice and sharing your bread with the hungry. These Jubilee themes kept appearing as the standard by which society was measured.
And that brings us back to the care for the poor, doesn't it? This wasn't just about economic theory, it was about real people in need.
Absolutely. The page content emphasizes that caring for the poor is central to God's character, and believers are called to reflect that heart. It's not optional charity, it's integral to faith and obedience to God.
And there's this powerful quote from Proverbs 14:31. If you mistreat the poor, you insult your creator. That's pretty direct.
It really is. And what I find striking is how this connects to the New Testament. The page content mentions that the apostles in Jerusalem urged Paul to remember the poor, which he was eager to fulfill. It wasn't just Old Testament law, it was central to early Christian identity.
So when we step back from all these details, the Sabbath years, the Jubilee, the distinctions between walled cities and unwalled villages, the care for the poor, what's the big picture here?
I think it's a complete reimagining of what a just society looks like. These weren't just religious rules, they were a comprehensive vision for economic justice, social equality, and spiritual formation, all working together. The page content calls it a profound framework for social, economic, and spiritual renewal.
And the fact that it's all grounded in this idea that God owns everything and we're just temporary stewards, that changes everything about how we think about wealth and responsibility.
Exactly. It challenges our most basic assumptions about ownership, success, and what we owe each other. Whether you're religious or not, these principles offer a radically different way of organizing society, one that prioritizes justice, sustainability, and human dignity over pure economic efficiency.
And maybe that's what we need to hear today. In a world where wealth inequality is growing and environmental sustainability is a real concern, these ancient principles might be more relevant than ever.
I think you're absolutely right. The Jubilee wasn't just about ancient Israel. It was about what's possible when a society decides to prioritize justice and mercy over accumulation and exploitation. That vision is as challenging today as it was 3,000 years ago.
Well, here's what strikes me most about Leviticus 25. It's not just ancient history or religious theory. It's a blueprint for economic justice that challenges everything we think we know about ownership, wealth, and our responsibility to each other. Whether it's the radical debt forgiveness of the Sabbath year, the complete economic reset of the Jubilee, or the built-in care for the poor, these principles offer a vision of what's possible when a society decides that justice matters more than profit.
And what makes it so powerful is that it's not just about policy, it's about identity. The fundamental claim that God owns everything and we're just temporary stewards completely reframes how we think about success, security, and what we owe each other. That's as revolutionary today as it was in ancient Israel.
So the next time you hear debates about wealth inequality, debt forgiveness, or caring for the poor, remember that these aren't new conversations. 3,000 years ago, an ancient text laid out a comprehensive vision for economic justice that's still challenging us today. The question isn't whether these principles are practical, it's whether we have the courage to imagine a different kind of society. Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts.